Could everybody start to take their seats, please? If everybody could start to take their seats, we can get started with our second panel. And Tim, can you close that door so we can keep the sound out? Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Kate Seeley, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the second panel of today's half-day conference on Egypt in crisis. If you were not here this morning, for those of you who weren't here this morning, I'd like to tell you about our new initiative that's taking place, the Arab Transitions Initiative, which is a program to basically drill down on into the issues, the complex changes and transformations taking place in the Middle East today. We're going to be looking at the countries where leadership changes have taken place since the 2011 protests. We'll be focusing on countries like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, countries that are dealing with new political actors, new players, new dynamics, new challenges, and new opportunities. So we'll be following them closely by bringing on scholars. We've already brought on Dr. Khalil Anani, who's an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood, who spoke in the panel this morning. We'll be bringing other voices from the region. We'll be stepping up our programming, bringing a lot more speakers, experts, analysts from Egypt, from Tripoli, from Tunis. And all of this is going to be anchored by a very innovative website that will not only be featuring the work of our scholars as well as commissioned work, but also highlighting this information through interactives, multimedia, video, and photo galleries. So it's going to be an exciting website. It should be up in about a week's time. Check it out. Now on to today's panel. Moderating today's panel is Charles Dunne, who's the Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programs at Freedom House and an MEI scholar. Prior to joining Freedom House, Charles spent 24 years as a diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service, serving in Cairo, in Jerusalem, and in Madras, India. In addition, he was Director for Iraq at the National Security Council from 2005 to 2007, and a foreign policy advisor to the Director for Strategic Plans and Policy at the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. Charles is going to be moderating this very important panel on Egyptian civil society in crisis, and now I'd like to hand the panel over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Kate. I really appreciate this, and I really appreciate your organizing this event, which is really important because Egypt is a critical country as we look at the Arab Spring, and we really do need to examine its issues of governance, foreign policy, and so on. When the conversation in Washington these days turns to Egypt, there's a lot of talk focused on Egypt's democratic transition. Now, while it's obvious that there has been a transition, it's not quite so obvious what Egypt has transitioned to. How long will this transition take? What are the country's politics going to be when Egypt finally settles down? These are all important questions that really need to be looked at closely. Freedom House does an annual survey called Freedom in the World, and we rate all 195 countries and territories on their degree of freedom and whether they have progressed or regressed. In Egypt, in our 2012 survey, in other words, our survey covering last year, we upgraded Egypt from the ranks of the not free to the partly free. And this is mostly, in fact, entirely due to the competitive presidential election that was held and the end of military rule. But as the first panel noted, there are still serious problems in Egypt. Political polarization there to an extent that makes our petty little problems here in Washington seem minor. A lack of consensus on the basic identity and direction of the country, and ongoing human rights abuses that simply picked up where the Mubarak regime left off. What we do know about Egypt is that, frankly, as the phrase goes, it's too big to fail. Now, there are really no good examples in modern Arab political history on which to model a successful transition to democracy, in my view. But given Egypt's demographic, historical, and cultural weight, this is a country that is going to be looked to for models throughout the region. Political trends in Egypt are widely watched, and the foreign policy ramifications are closely followed from Washington to Tehran. Autocrats and Democrats both look to Egypt for examples on how to advance or how to thwart the advance of democracy. For example, the UAE, when it shut down 3 international civil society organizations last year, publicly noted that it had done so in part because Egypt had already done this. These are 3 of the organizations that were shut down in the raid that closed the Freedom House offices there in 2011 as well. So to paraphrase a slogan from another very popular desert kingdom, Las Vegas, what happens in Egypt doesn't stay in Egypt. So there are big equities at stake here in this country, which will determine its future. There are big equities at stake here for the international community, and particularly for U.S.-Egyptian relations. These include Arab-Israeli peace, U.S. military access to Egyptian waterways and airways, counterterrorism cooperation, and last but not least, the Arab Spring's endgame. All of these hang in the balance in Egypt. So domestic political governance in the country, in my view, is going to be determinant of its future, its level of stability, and its impact on regional affairs. And not to mention the most important question, well, I guess I will mention it, whether Egyptians will be subject to a rollover of autocracy or an expansion of freedom in their own country. And this is what critically matters to Egyptians. So 4 key issues are the subject of this panel. And all of these impact on the question of Egypt's domestic political governance and the key to where Egypt is headed. This includes the environment for civil society, the status of media freedom, whether women can consolidate and expand their rights, and whether religious minorities, in particular the Copts, will be protected and respected. So if you're looking for the proverbial canaries in the coal mine, these are the issues that form them. We have a great panel today to discuss all of these issues, and let me introduce them very briefly. I think you have their bios in your packet. First of all, Adel Iskandar is a scholar of media and international communication. He's the author and co-author of several works, including Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism. He teaches at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in Georgetown, my alma mater, at Georgetown. Amira Maaty is a program officer with the National Endowment for Democracy. She specializes in Egypt and Libya. Heba is an independent legal researcher who is living in D.C. Prior to moving to the Washington area, she was a lecturer in law at Cairo University. And Samuel Tadros is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. He's also a professorial lecturer at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. So I'm happy to turn over the panel to our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Charles for the introduction, and to Kate and the Middle East Institute for hosting this panel. I would like to focus my remarks, I know many people have read a lot in the news about the NGO law and the trial against the international organization. So I'd like to focus my remarks on 2 areas that I feel are not getting as much attention in the media. The first is that there is a much deeper encroachment on civil society in Egypt than the NGO trial and the new NGO law. Those are 2 very big things, but over the past 2 years, despite that the law hasn't changed, we have seen new directives and steps to stifle independent civil society in Egypt, and that has not gotten as sufficient media coverage and international attention in some of the other bigger stories. Second, we've all heard the argument for civil society from a rights perspective and freedom of association perspective, but there are much vaster implications to stifling civil society in Egypt. As Charles mentioned, this is an entity, a sector that really builds the foundations of the new Egypt, and it's a vital organ, a vital artery for pumping life into Egypt's development process through providing expertise, ideas, solutions, alternatives, and stifling that stifles growth in Egypt. So those are my two main areas that I want to focus on. First, I will talk briefly about the law. There isn't a final official version that's publicized, but there are many different drafts that are under consideration, and there seems to be consensus around some basic principles. And those principles would essentially, currently the Egyptian law is considered one of the most restrictive in the world. And this new law would add additional restrictions, especially making it very difficult for international organizations working in Egypt. First, one main area of concern is that the new law would potentially strictly prohibit foreign civil society organizations that receive government funding directly or indirectly. And as you can imagine, this affects more than just the democracy or the rights groups, which many believe is the catalyst or the impetus behind this move, that many development organizations in Egypt are funded or supported by government funding. And even so far, several development organizations, such as Oxfam, for example, their staff have said that if this new law passes, it would be very difficult for them to do work in Egypt. Second, there's a new interagency coordinating committee that would be created that would have broad authority and control over civil society organizations. It would add an additional layer of bureaucracy. And currently the bureaucracy is quite difficult. Anybody who has worked with or has been part of civil society organizations in Egypt knows how difficult it is for these NGOs to get approvals for grants to implement programs locally. And most importantly, there is language that would identify civil society funds as public funds. This has very critical implications in Egyptian law. That there's very high penalties for misuse of public funds. It's considered a felony, and it would also create space for additional interference of state into civil society activities. I'll give you one kind of anecdotal example of how this potentially could be used. Again, without this law passing, there was one incident in which a number of groups, or registered NGOs in a particular district in Egypt that were called in by the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs, which is the regulatory body that oversees the organizations. And basically they were told, you all receive foreign funding, so we want you to dedicate 10% of your grants to cleaning the streets because that's our priority. So that really opens up, at this point that wouldn't particularly be legal, but some language like this could potentially legalize that kind of behavior. Finally, the law also has very high fines for violations of the law. And, there had been discussions and previous drafts did include prison terms. My understanding is the latest drafts have removed that, but again, the fact that NGO funds are considered public funds keeps that on the table. I also want to note that with the law as it is, there is potential for this to be a constitutional issue. The new constitution has Article 51, which gives citizens the right to create associations, institutions, and parties. Only notification is necessary, and they practice their activities freely. So there is potential that this could be challenged on a constitutional basis. Aside from the law, I'd like to go over some of the other encroachments that we've seen over the past 2 years. First, soon after the revolution, we saw an incredibly aggressive media campaign against civil society organizations. They were labeled as traitors. They were labeled as, foreign-funded agents. And a lot of times the media attacks preempt or they come before a more aggressive campaign to stifle civil society. So this was right before a Ministry of Justice report or investigation started looking into 400 NGOs in Egypt, aside from the international organizations. And this was also before the raids on the international organizations as well as a number of local organizations. And we continue to see these media attacks ebb and flow. And we're seeing another one emerge in this period that with the new NGO law coming up and also the verdict for the international trial coming on June 4th. Second, I mentioned the July 2011 Ministry of Justice investigation of 400 NGOs. That investigation went on for several months. There wasn't any direct information or contact with the organizations that were being investigated. Most of the information about this was leaked in the press, so organizations would be surprised to find their name in the newspapers. It wasn't just limited to organizations, but also individuals who are behind the organizations in their personal accounts. One organization, also a registered NGO that sought approvals. It was one of the groups that was listed in the investigation, and the director of it had trouble opening a personal bank account for a year. Another area where there has been, encroachment on the space for civil society is in August 2011, the central bank asked all domestic banks to ensure that licenses granted to NGOs by the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs are valid and give them the right to receive such funds. So what does that mean? In the past, though Egypt has currently a restrictive law, by law, within 60 days, or some people interpret it that way. Again, the issue is not just the law, because there's the law and then there's regulatory implementing regulations that control how the law is implemented. But there was language in the current law that says that approval should come within 60 days. In reality, they never came within 60 days. But what happened is, depending on the NGO, some would start implementing activities after 60 days. What happens now is that once those funds are in an account, they are frozen until the organization can demonstrate government approval. The approvals now are taking upwards of a year, if they come at all. Administrative delays and rejections. Again, in addition to these approvals taking a very long time, in 2012 alone, the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs announced that they rejected 93.3 million pounds of grants to Egyptian organizations for security reasons. And again, those reasons are not clearly explained. And then when groups try to appeal these, to take the issue to court, those court cases remain ongoing for a very long time. There's a couple of cases now that I know of that have been in process for over a year. And even if even if rules come in favor of these organizations, those organizations still have to deal with the administrative body, the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs, and the same bureaucrats who rejected them and created the hurdles for them in the first place. So it's a very complicated, complex tangle that civil society organizations in Egypt have to face. And again, these regulations continue. There's one after the other. And just recently in February, the Prime Minister issued administrative instructions to the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs that prohibits NGOs from cooperating with foreign entities in writing researches or studies. Several NGOs received a letter to this effect. And again, it's very vaguely written. What does that mean? Does it mean that NGOs cannot participate in writing shadow reports with the United Nations? They can't, So there's a lot of these kind of directives that come out, and they kind of go under the radar, and these are really kind of affecting the day-to-day operation of civil society in Egypt. Another kind of trend that we've been seeing more of recently is more and more frequent audits and reviews of various administrative bodies over NGOs, so more and more visits from the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs, more and more visits from tax authorities. There's a number of different actions that are being taken now that really kind of restrict these organizations' ability to move. So what are the implications of this? Why does this matter? There are so many things going on in Egypt right now. It's, there's economic challenges, there's political challenges. Why should we care about civil society? First, civil society plays much more than just the rights-based role. Like Egypt has over 40,000 registered NGOs. There's development organizations. There's organizations that are policy centers, watchdog organizations. This is critical for forming the ideas, the solutions, the leaders for the future. So it really does stifle the ability for kind of new ideas to grow in the country. In terms of civil society development, these restrictions affect the sustainability of civil society organizations. I know that civil society organization is often criticized for being ineffective, for being weak, for being fragmented. But how can you build an institution when all the cards are stacked against you? The current environment discourages new groups from forming. If you're an NGO and you're waiting a year to get approval for a grant, how are you going to be able to hire and maintain staff? If you're constantly facing attacks in the media, how are you going to be able to recruit reputable people to speak openly and independently? Also, the current situation is deterring international organizations. Obviously, the trial against international NGOs, sends a huge message to the international community. And again, this doesn't just affect the rights groups. This is also something that the development organizations should be concerned about. And another issue is that the current environment puts the entire burden on civil society organization, but lacks to address the concerns about the administrative body that regulates it. Bribing officials in the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs happens. That's something that takes place. It's not uncommon to see Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs folks who are supposed to regulate NGOs on the payroll of NGOs. That's not unusual. On my last visit, I sat in an NGO. There was somebody there from the Ministry of Insurance and Social Affairs, and he told me, I'm affiliated with NGO A, B, C, D. My boss is affiliated with X, Y, Z, and you come to us and we tell you who to work with. So, is this really kind of the best regulatory environment for civil society? Nobody's saying that these should go unregulated. No, but there should be fair regulation, transparent regulation. And also, traditionally there's been a special treatment for gongos or government-sponsored NGOs. So the government will tell you, oh, well, we may have rejected 90 million grants, but we approved, hundreds of millions of others. But there's definitely different favors for organizations that say what the authorities want to hear and don't ruffle any feathers. What other implications are there for this? Egypt's economy is already volatile. This is a sector. There's 40,000 NGOs in Egypt. The numbers that I've heard is it's roughly 3% of the workforce in Egypt, which is actually quite small for a developing country. So this is a sector that, in fact, could be expanded in a time where Egypt needs, to develop opportunities for its young people. This is an area where youth can have a tremendous impact in shaping and contributing to their country. I also want to point out a fantastic policy brief that Brookings Institute produced last year on the regulatory reforms needed for inclusive economic growth in Egypt, and they made a very strong economic argument for the need of an NGO law that empowers civil society to contribute to a more equitable environment. And they discussed the multitude of roles that NGOs can play in developing an economy. On social and political development, as I've mentioned, these are platforms. I'd like to just kind of give an example here, since Middle East Institute was kind enough to host this. In preparing for this discussion, I did some research, and I learned that Middle East Institute really receives significant amount of foreign grants. So what if this organization had to get approvals for every single grant? What if they had to, and those grants took a year or more? What if, would this organization be able to contribute to the dialogue? Would the panelists here be able to speak openly? Would people attend if you know that there's a security person sitting in the audience and creating a file against you? So this really just stifles voices. And in the past, civil society had even provided a platform for members of the Muslim Brotherhood who are now in power. So this is, an important platform that's missing from Egypt right now. Finally, just really quickly, I'd like to put forth a few recommendations. Where do we go from here? There needs to continue to be a push for greater NGO freedom in Egypt, and please keep in mind that it should go beyond just the law, beyond just the international trial, and that we should be careful with cosmetic changes because, even if a good law passes or it's shelved now, and once there's other priorities, another law is passed, it's important to also look at the regulatory framework and the implementing regulations. There also is a need to, empower, institutionalize the empowerment of civil society through international assistance programs. So international assistance programs that provide government support should include a component that empowers and raises the inclusion of civil society organizations. Also, it's not unusual that after 30 years of dictatorship that there's a mistrust between civil society and government. It's very unfortunate that civil society is seen as an enemy and viewed with suspicion. So there really needs to be a dialogue process that builds trust between civil society and the state. I think with that, I will conclude my remarks. I'm sure there will be lots of questions in the Q&A period.
Yes, thank you. I mean, the regulatory process in particular is just opaque in Egypt. I mean, we, Freedom House, were registered, well, we tried to register in December of 2011, and as soon as the papers were filed and approved by the Foreign Ministry, they then shut us down 3 days later. So, yeah, it's a journey, let me put it that way. Anyway, Adel, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude to the Middle East Institute for this kind invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with distinguished panelists. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Kate, for making this happen. Okay, my remarks are pertain to the media situation in Egypt, and it's somewhat peculiar to be situating the discussion around media in the context of civil society, given the fact that typically most media organizations don't fall within the civil society organization sort of structural or institutional, or at least in an institutional sense, but nevertheless anything that curtails the freedom of expression and freedom of the press can contribute, or can contribute negatively or detrimentally to the state of civil society in any respective country. I'm going to basically divide my remarks into two sort of categories. One where I'm basically identifying scenarios whereby the media in Egypt have faltered significantly, and another circumstance where I feel the media have actually flourished. So I'm a little bit schizophrenic here, and I think it makes some sense that one should feel that way. And I've heard iterations of this kind of sentiment from the previous panel as well. Of course, the most notable examples of attempts to curtail the media are the ones that we hear about that, of course, make their way into the international press. The story of Bassem Youssef, the equivalent of Jon Stewart in Egypt, who, of course, is, he satirizes and parodies and ridicules and makes fun of both the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi, and that, of course, has kept him busy in the courts for the last little while. But it is sort of a shocking reminder of sort of a legal code that sort of predates most of Egypt's rulers of the last century, if you will, that renders the Egyptian president or the Egyptian executive office outside of sort of popular discussion, debate, critique, and scrutiny. So insulting the president, while it's in the books legally speaking, is sort of a safeguard to basically identify political adversaries, target them, and undermine them. And so even though Mubarak himself was not immune to criticism, he deployed some of the same strategies that Mohamed Morsi has now, which is basically to say that anybody who sort of treads into that space will be targeted, legally speaking, and then the only way out is through an official presidential decree or a pardoning of sorts. And we've seen that happen both in the case of Hosni Mubarak, when the prominent case of Ibrahim Isa, sort of a top oppositional independent journalist and editor-in-chief of a major newspaper, had sort of served both jail time and had a fairly extended case, not necessarily for insulting the president directly, but at least for questioning or raising the issue of the president's health publicly, which was then deemed an issue of national security, and that it was a problem for foreign investment in Egypt. And so Bassem Youssef kind of falls into that category as well, alongside, at this point, hundreds of other citizens and members of the media specifically. And then Mohamed Morsi came out not too long ago and basically pardoned all of these people and dismissed the cases against them. And of course, it is an affirmation of the kind of benevolence that the president has, and a so-called gesture to a new atmosphere in Egypt. But of course, that belies a significant problem that is really quite problematic. Now, keep in mind that the Egyptian media environment keeps oscillating back and forth between sort of indications of extreme freedom and complete authoritarianism. So while the laws, or the law today, allows for any publication to be licensed or ratified or to operate in the country simply by notification, any publication that violates any number of legal codes, both constitutional and sub-constitutional, can face significant cases in court, and has to answer also to any complaint brought to the public prosecutor against their conduct or their work, and which of course busies the court system and also busies the legal associates and the legal offices that work with the media directly. So it seems as though Egypt's media is remarkably free, but there are sort of crippling investigations and crippling sort of court cases that render the very incentive to publish in a free environment a problematic one. So, I mean, who wants to publish in an environment that is this problematic. So I'm going to go through what I feel is a laundry list of how the media is faltering in Egypt. First of all, we've got legalistic problems. I mean, we've got legal codes that predate the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi. Some of them are a product of the Mubarak government. Some of them date back to the 1954 period, immediately after the coup d'etat that brought the free officer to power, and the 60 years of sort of militarized environment in Egypt, where the military as an institution became a Pandora's box, impossible to scrutinize, critique, discuss, or even present. Any mention of the military in the public press was considered very problematic and could automatically transfer the file into sort of an issue of national security. And the censors were fairly good at making sure that none of this came out, and journalists and reporters and media practitioners were taught to observe this through self-censorship and through a chilling effect. So these codes date back a fairly long time. Today, of course, there's a public prosecutor who's extremely sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood and will only bring cases, or has typically only brought cases through the legal system, through to investigation and to trial, that are incriminating to the opposition or the opposition media specifically. In addition to that, we also have a constitutional environment that, for the first time, legalizes curtailment against the media. Today, the Constitution, while of course it seems rosy and really quite lovely and wonderful in its sort of in its commitment to a free press and an open environment, it is the only or first constitution that I'm aware of in Egypt's sort of recent and in contemporary history that makes it permissible by law for a journalist to serve jail time for what they publish, which of course by most international standards is considered not only problematic but is very draconian. Typically, the direction that most international media are heading in is as far away from that as possible. Even in the most extreme cases of libel, slander, and defamation, typically the punishment is exacted against, or the prosecution is exacted against the media organization, the institution, the editorial services, things of that sort, and through a very, very hefty process rather than jail time for journalists specifically. So this is to scare essentially the foot soldiers within these media institutions. If you're a reporter on the ground covering a story and you feel as though you might be treading into problematic territory, you know that you could be the target. Nobody's going to take the hit for you. There's no shielding whatsoever. And of course, there are constitutional articles that by default infringe on media practice. For instance, the laws that the constitutional articles that deal with the commitment of the state to protect and preserve Egyptian national identity, which of course is a very vague and uninterpretable statement, but it also means that anyone who expresses an opinion publicly or in the public press that may be deemed unbecoming in terms of sort of social conduct or social mores or social acceptability, of course, in the eye of the beholder, can be targeted legally. So this is, of course, Bassem Youssef falls into that category by his use of either suggestive language or, insults here and there. I mean, that, satire creates a little bit of leeway, but when you've got a constitution that's so restrictive and prohibitive, you can use it as an instrument to control the media and target reporters and journalists, and respectively. We've also got an environment of significant popular intimidation, where when the institutions, both of the state and the judiciary and others, are incapable of silencing dissent or opposition within the media environment, they have sort of other ways to do so. The media production city, which houses most of the private television networks in Egypt, has been under siege on numerous occasions, a couple of occasions at least, in one particular circumstance for more than 2 weeks, which involved, of course, direct intimidation, death threats against reporters, anchors, journalists, television personalities who are considered oppositional to the Muslim Brotherhood and the sort of Islamist current. That, of course, is a fairly notable part of the two-pronged strategy. So you've got institutions, and then you've got populist intimidation strategies. There's also, quite unfortunately, the Ministry of Information, which is, of course is considered, or is often considered, a symbol of a bygone era of, who has a Ministry of Information. It sounds kind of ridiculous. Even the government of Qatar has had to do away, at least symbolically, with their Ministry of Information to be able to shepherd in a broadcast station like Al Jazeera, which is of course full of its own problems. But nevertheless, the idea of keeping the Ministry of Information and preserving it in the post-Mubarak era was considered utterly repugnant, if not an impossibility, around the middle of 2011. So the fact that the Ministry of Information has not only resuscitated itself, but has someone at its helm who is running it in the same fashion as his predecessors from the NDP only exacerbates the problem. And this is the kind of in fact, there's a lot of news coming out about the Ministry of Information in Egypt, and some of the statements that he's made publicly. He is said to have sexually harassed or implied sexual harassment in a press conference towards a journalist who was asking him, "Where is this freedom that's going?" He's like, "I'll tell you where the freedom is." Anyway, those types of things are not uncustomary, which is extremely strange. Basically, I think it's a greater indication of how extremely unseasoned these institutions have become over the last period, and really is a reminder of how extremely obsolete and negligible they really are, but they remain sort of a reminder of this relic of the past. And with the Muslim Brotherhood in power, trying to resuscitate them, to control this media scene and to kind of curb political dissent, they unfortunately have a very ominous feel about them. We've also got the Shura Council, which we're all familiar with, and the role that it plays in trying to regulate the media. Of course, filling in for Parliament, it is responsible largely of developing a regulatory system to control or to regulate, which in essence translates to control, quite unfortunately, the media environment in Egypt. There's, of course, new ways of criminalizing dissent in Egypt. There's sort of a decline. There's also a major decline in the quality of journalism in Egypt. Of course, when you have a plethora of new media organizations, and of course, I speak very highly of citizen journalism, but at the end of the day, there are, professional standards have declined significantly, and today, in most instances, a rumor can become breaking news at any given moment in Egypt, and so there isn't, the impulse to corroborate, verify information, and of course, information typically falls within a spectrum, a highly polarized political spectrum today. Media organizations can literally be categorized into two groups: those who are either sympathetic or work well within the current sort of governmental environment and are agreeable with the policies of the Muslim Brotherhood, and there are those who are very ardently and stringently oppositional. And this, of course, this environment is extremely unhealthy for obvious reasons. And when you're watching one part, one aspect or one camp, you see no criticism whatsoever of the Muslim Brotherhood, and on the other side you see nothing but criticism of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the encampment and the entrenchment and the media, as far as media is concerned, has basically thrown away all journalistic standards of professionalism out the window. I mean, it would be negligible to try and sort of identify where these standards lie. There are many signs of this polarization, but one of the key indications that this polarization is politically prescribed is can be sorted out when one is able to follow the buck by figuring out where the political, economic structures lie and who's funding what organization and for what reason. The political motives are typically easy to identify, but however, in the context of an economic crisis that we've all been speaking about. How am I doing?
We're right on time.
Oh, well, okay. This is all faltering. I haven't said anything positive.
23 seconds.
23 seconds. All right. Okay, so it's all bad news, bad news, bad news. All right, no, it's not. No, there's actually something really refreshing going on in Egypt today. And with the explosion of the media and the extreme diversity, the watchdog roles, has all of a sudden become like an attack dog role. Now, of course, the term dog doesn't translate very well in Arabic, so you can never really convince journalists that they need to be dogs in any way. There's also a diminishing of the red lines. Some of these laws that I've described have become almost obsolete and negligible. Journalists and reporters basically ignore them and continue doing what they're doing in hope that with critical mass that they're capable of subverting this legal process. So negligibility of laws, there are of course mass acquittals as a result. So most of the cases end up resulting in acquittal because literally the public sentiment is typically in opposition to any curtailment of the press. The intimidation hasn't been working. Journalists have used the intimidation to really increase their fare and their popularity in the media. Of course, you look at Bassem Youssef and various others. Anybody who's been targeted by the prosecutor, public prosecutor, or by sort of the populist movement of the Salafis, for instance, outside the media production city, has seen their stakes rise. So, and professionalism is increasing, and fortunately or unfortunately, Islamist journalism is extremely poor in quality, or is practically non-existent. So it has a very hard time sort of responding to everyone else. The professional syndicate, the journalist professional syndicate in Egypt, has had a significant election that led to the trouncing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course is quite peculiar given the role and the impact that the Brotherhood's playing. So I think that just to conclude, that what's happening in Egypt today is really a very anarchic state, and when it comes to the media, and in many instances, this anarchic state is quite a refreshing thing. When we think of anarchism, we tend to kind of freak out. It's like, oh my God, we work well within institutions. We need institutional structures. But I think freedom of the press and freedom of the media today in Egypt is happening without the institutions rather than within them. Thank you.
Thanks. I was just thinking of Jon Stewart's response to the Morsi government's attack on Bassem Youssef. Now, he said, I spent 8 years trying to take down a president, and President Morsi, I didn't succeed at all. So it shouldn't be a threat. Anyway, Heba, I think we're going to turn to the issue of women's rights in modern and emerging modern Egypt. Thanks.
Okay. What I would like to talk about is not so much women's rights in emerging Egypt or transitioning Egypt, but it's more women movement in transitioning Egypt. I sympathize with Adel's schizophrenia, and I think it's a phenomena of anybody who's trying to figure out what's happening with the transition. And Charlie's statement at the beginning is, what is Egypt transitioning to is spot on, and the answer is we really do not know. In my short intervention, I have to warn you, I'm going to present a sort of a case of optimism. So anybody here who's allergic to optimism may not really enjoy what I'm going to say. So, but how I will go about it, I would like to sort of tell you what women did in the revolution, what happened after the departure of Mubarak. I wouldn't say in post-revolution because I don't know. I mean, when revolution begins and ends, what is happening? What is the role of women during the transition? In doing so, I want to show what is a continuity from the past relating to the women's movement and what is new. And in the bit relating to what is new, that's where I'm going to make my pitch for more optimism. Okay, so were women integral to the protest and the activities leading to the revolution and to the protest days on the street? Yes, for sure. I mean, we can say with certainty that in 2008, the Mahalla event that are marked as basically the trigger point of what happened later on in 2011, were triggered by Isra Abdel Fattah. We actually have a name, and that name is a woman's name. And they started with 3,000 female textile laborers protesting against government policies. And their slogan was, here are the women, where are the men? So we know for sure historically that in 2008 the movement started with women. We also know that in 2011, at least Asma Mahfouz has a blog that shows she called people to the streets on January 25. So women were very much active and integral and torch holder in the lead up and in the actual days of protest on the street. But then what happened after people left Tahrir Square on February 11 when President Mubarak stepped down? What happened was I would say, quite typical of a patriarchal society. When transition discussions started taking place, patriarchy again took over, you know. So when you look at, for example, all the coalition groups that formed trying to negotiate the relationship between the protesters on the street and the military council, you find that they were predominantly male figures. When you look at the advisory council that the military council, the civilian advisory council that the military council formed to help it navigate the transition, you find that there were only 3 women in a council of 30 men. So we're still at the 10% ratio. Then when you go look around at the different parties that started forming post stepping down of the Mubarak regime, you find that they were dominated almost entirely by men. A movement like Masrina, which was trying to present a sort of a conciliatory voice and a more modern conciliatory voice, and had the people like Wael Ghunaim on it and Mu'taz Abdel Fattah. When you look at the picture, at the sort of the group picture of this group, you find that there were no women in that group. So there is no, I mean, I can go on, and we can. There is no doubt that the transition was patriarchal in at least formally, not so much on the street. Then also, you know, you come to the parliamentary election, and that happened in 2012, and the dissolved parliament right now, and you find that women eventually, 340 give and take women ran for parliament. And eventually, the women who made it were only 8 women, 4 of which were from the Freedom and Justice Party, and 4 from the rest. So, so the transition, the women, their role in the protests and in the lead up to the street protests did not translate in actual role in the decision making. I stop here and say, is this new or is this a continuity? And I would argue this is a continuity of how Egyptian society has operated throughout. Since the women assumed political or got their political rights in '56, women representation in elected institutions did not exceed 2.4% at best. Even in 2010, when the regime introduced women quota, it was not quota as part of the already established number of the parliamentarians. It was an add-on, 64 more seats for women. So, so it's not unusual. I can even go further back. In 1919, which is some historians mark it as the beginning of the feminist movement, women were very active in the protests, anti-colonial protests, but then did the 1923 constitution give them political rights? No. Women only got political rights in Egypt in '56. So the story of instrumentalizing the women movement for a particular national agenda, like anti-colonialism or social rights, or during the '52 period, and in 2011, and then abandoning the woman issue and marginalizing the woman voice in the more concrete discussion about what to do, where to go from here, or what to do in the future is not new, and it's part of, it's not so much a political trend. We can argue it is more of a societal trend. What about women's rights. What happened to women's rights after the transition? There is a lot of fear going on. I mean, and this is understandable, and we do not need to rehearse the reasons why people are so alarmed. There is political Islam in government, and there are a lot of images and rhetoric associated with this particular political trend, and it is normal that there is a lot of anxiety about what will happen to women under such a regime. But let's look concretely at the legal text that emerged out of these, so far since the beginning of the transition. Yeah, the Constitution, as Adel mentioned, has some alarming trends. I mean, there is a hint of some kind of references that lawyers do not like to fluid concepts like identity, like the original nature of the Egyptian family, like the duties of women. Yeah, these are there, and the tones are very obvious and alarming for anybody who is concerned about a more conservative approach to women's role in public life. But are they conclusive enough? I would argue no. Actually, the provision in the Constitution that talks about women's rights states the state has to guarantee for free the services to mother and child, and to the state again, and to balancing the rights of women versus their duties in the society. So it's a very vague provision. Of course, if you read it with a political Islam rhetoric in mind, you would say, yeah, this provision means to restrict women's rights. I can read it, and I'm a lawyer, I can go to court and argue that the state has an obligation to guarantee to me that I can work, and that they will give me child care that will help me balance my duties vis-a-vis the family and the at the same time as I'm doing my public duty. So I can make this argument. I looked at this provision closely, and I thought I can really make this argument in a court of law. So even though the provisions were negotiated, probably behind them where they were trying to capture the more conservative ideas of woman duty to the family and so on, but the way the provisions emerge, they are not conclusive. What does that mean from a legal perspective? It means that it will depend on the judiciary to interpret these provisions and give them their teeth. I would say that it will take a very long time to turn the Egyptian judiciary from a sort of a judiciary that, maybe I can't classify it. I mean, is it a conservative judiciary? Can we even talk about it as a monolith or not? I can't even say, but it will take a very long time to enshrine these conservative values in the judiciary to the point where these provisions are interpreted in a way that really restricts women's rights, and there will be a lot of arguments back and forth. So all I'm saying is that the restrictions that we are so afraid of has not yet materialized, and the process towards making them concrete and real in women's life and every day is a complex process, and we don't know where it will really take us. Will this process favor a conservative outcome or a conservative society, or will this process ultimately favor a different formula? As far as what happened to the women movement is concerned, I'd like to draw your attention to some developments that I would call optimistic. Of course, I mean, Amira's presentation and the talk about the restrictions of the civil society potentially could impinge on a women movement as well. But I don't want to stop at the point of the formal civil society and how it is affected by laws, and conclude from that women movement will suffer, because I don't think that the relationship between those two things is linear. Actually, the literature has argument whether grants helped women movement or not. I mean, literature, I mean, not related to the January 25 revolution or anything. Generally, it's a complex relationship. But what I can say has happened, and I argue is positive for the women movement, is three things. One, we can see that there is a form of indigenization of women movement in Egypt. Women movement up until 2011 was, and you can argue back and forth, but generally was perceived as upper middle class movement, and was typically influenced by one strand or another of external ideology that is not indigenous to the Egyptian society. Whether that indigenous external ideology is leftist or Western, it doesn't matter, but it was perceived as a movement that comes from outside. Perceiving a form of indigenization of the women movement. Like, for example, who are the big symbols of female activists now? Asma Mahfouz, Rasha Azim, Isra Abdel Fattah. The profiles of these women in Egyptian society is quite distinct from the profile of the typical figures of the feminist movement. The feminist movement in its initial stages in Egypt spoke in French. So the women that are currently represent the faces of the Egyptian feminist movement in Egypt do not belong to the same social class that typically staffed the women movement prior to 2011. That is positive if you agree with me that an indigenous woman movement is much more likely to thrive and to deliver rights for the local people. The second point is that at the moment we have a strong society and a weaker state. If we go back to history, for example, I'll draw a parallel. The best period in which Egypt formed the judicial tradition that it has, and where we developed the values of independence, and where the judiciary felt its independence from the state and asserted itself, it was in the 30s and 40s. And the main characteristic of this period was the weakness of the state. We had a minister of justice every other day. So the Ministry of Justice could not exert pressure over the judiciary, and in that context, the judiciary thrived and developed its independence and its character. I'm arguing that a parallel process is happening now. Right now, we have a society that is bigger than the state. So no matter what the rhetoric of the state is, and the state is not in a strong position in this equation, and that offers a great opportunity for a women's movement. Similar things happened actually in women movement in the early 50s. That's when Bint Nil stormed the parliament, because the state was still weak at that stage. Of course, later on it became much more powerful, and the women movement suffered as a result of it. But at that moment in time, before the state acquired the full strength, it was very helpful to the women movement. And I think we're observing a similar moment, now even a more powerful moment of society versus state, where there's a great opportunity for the civil society to build itself, and part of that is the woman movement. Another element, that is a related element, is this the tension. I really truly believe that this moment is a moment of tension, and that tension is positive. The fragmentation of the women movement, not the fragmentation of the civil society, but the different polars of the women movement. In the past, when the state started capturing the women movement, and we saw the national the creation of the National Women Council, that was basically straight capture of women movement. And then you could find, the state and the satellite of the state, the National Council for Women, and then you found some, satellite NGOs working around that space, and the tension was therefore minimal at that point. What we have at the moment is you saw, I don't know, maybe you have not, on March 26th, President Morsi announced a presidential initiative for the protection of women's rights. And his partners in this initiative were the Institute of Social Studies and Criminal Justice. It was remarkable that the presidency did not partner with the National Council for Women, even though the National Council for Women is still active. The reason for that is the National Council of Women is staffed by people who are counted as pro-Mubarak, or were part of the Mubarak system. So you can see now that there are different poles. The National Council is still active, arguing against the presidency. The presidency is trying to capture. Then you have formal civil society, and then you have the informal women movement that are not documented, or even political movement led by women, like No to Military Trials, which is a huge movement led primarily by women. So I'll stop here. I got my note that I need to stop, but I mean, you can see where I'm coming from on that. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. That's very interesting, and I really appreciate the parallel with the situation in 1919, in which women were in the forefront of protests against the government, and I think, and then were rolled back. And I think you're seeing that not only in Egypt today, but in other Arab Spring countries, where, I mean, in Libya, for example, where women were actually, smuggling arms and sometimes taking up arms on the front, and now all of their rights and accomplishments politically during that period are now being called into question. You see the same thing in Tunisia very much too. So that'll be an interesting topic for discussion during the Q&A period. So let me turn it over to Sam.
Well, thank you for organizing the panel and for inviting me. Heba attempted to give a note of optimism. It seems my role is to give the reverse note, that of pessimism, as I discuss the situation or the challenges facing Egypt's Christians, known as the Copts. Perhaps one of the most iconic images of the events of the Egyptian chapter of the Arab Spring was the image of Christians and Muslims praying together, holding hands in Tahrir Square. Coming about a month after this horrific bombing of a church in Alexandria, it gave the image that things were finally changing in Egypt, that instead of an increased level of sectarianism, we were witnessing an ushering of a new period where religious divisions would be less significant in this new Egypt. Instead of that image, 2 years later, we're getting different images. We're getting images of an attack on a cathedral, increased sectarian attacks on Copts, this threat rising against Christians in Egypt. The question is, the question the Copts are basically asking is whether this Arab Spring or this Egyptian revolution has really introduced a better era for them, or has led to worse situation for them than was before. Copts certainly under Mubarak did not live in heaven. They were really suffering from various forms of discrimination. Since the Egyptian revolution, we've witnessed the continuation and reinforcement of previous patterns of discrimination, B, the increase in the number and level of attacks against Christians, and C, the emergence of new patterns or new ways of discrimination and threats to the Coptic community. This problem has had two reasons or two main antagonizers in creating that situation. First is the question of the state collapse, or the complete removal of any constraint that the state used to do willingly, most of the times unwillingly, to stop this kind of violence. And also the question of the Islamist ascendancy, the removal of any constraints on local Islamists and their ability to enforce their views. Copts, the challenges facing Copts today come on two basic levels. First is the challenge on the national level. Perhaps this is the one that grabs the more attention it gets coverage in New York Times or Washington Post, both in form of an increase in the level of incitement, rumors, accusations against Christians in Egypt, sometimes associated with elections. They were accused of being behind the voting for presidential candidate Ahmed Shafiq. Accusations related to demonstrations. They're always accused of being a large part of the demonstrations against the Brotherhood. So this increased level of incitement nationally by the Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamists, and creating an atmosphere that creates a golden opportunity for attacks against Christians. Secondly, has been their exclusion from the political process. By this, I mean that while the Muslim Brotherhood initially paid some lip service to the idea of inclusion of both the opposition in general and the Christian minority, this has not been the case in governance. While there were statements on CNN indicating, yeah, we might think about the possibility of appointing a Christian vice president, for example, this has not materialized. The Egyptian government has its lowest now representations of Christians in its entire history. The Egyptian governors, after Mubarak in his last years had introduced the idea of appointing for the first time a Christian governor, this is no longer the case. So we've seen a level of Coptic exclusion from the political process in the Constitutional Writing Committee, for example, minimal Coptic representation. The third level in which this manifests itself nationally is in the Egyptian constitution, or the text that the Islamists were able to pass last December. There are many extremely problematic articles in the Egyptian constitution. To cite a couple of them that are relevant to the situation of Copts or of religious minorities in general, while Article 2 of the principles of Islamic Sharia has always been there recently in the Egyptian constitution, it has been reinforced with another article, 219, that basically explains what those principles are, limiting them to the evidence and foundational and jurisprudence basis of the accepted sources according to the four schools of, or the five schools, I might say, of the doctrines of Sunni Islam. The article that prohibited discrimination on the basis of religion, ethnic background, and so on, now has removed all this language. It only states that it is prohibited to discriminate. The Article 1 now includes an emphasis on a belonging to an Islamic nation that was never there. There's a new clause, Article 44, that deals with the blasphemy cases, this prohibition on any insults to God. We have the article that prohibited the establishment of political parties on the basis, or religious political parties on the basis of religion, has been removed. The practice of religion, building of houses of worship, is now according to national interest. The religious endowments, this is a huge issue for the Coptic Church, where there has been a rise of accusations that the church receives a lot of money from outside and we need to monitor this. We don't want the church to be independent from the state. So this Article 212, which forces a regulatory body on religious endowments, is also very problematic. Articles that dealt with forced evacuation, prohibiting forced evacuations of Egyptians within the country, that part has been removed from the constitution. The Heba cases, or Article 10, which deals with society's right to protect the values of the Egyptian family. The article, clear problem of an Article 81 that restricts all the freedoms and rights in the Egyptian constitution with the wording that they should not be contradictory to the chapter section 1 of the constitution, which has the principles of Islamic Sharia. So this is the challenge on the national level. Now, perhaps more importantly is the challenge on the local level that's taking place. As I mentioned, local Islamists are emboldened both by the fact that one of their own brethren is today the president of Egypt, that they are running the country, plus the idea that the police, the enemy that used to, via its own methods, torture, whatever, constrained their ability to take matters into their own hands, has been removed. This has meant basically that Islamists are now more capable of enforcing their view on their surrounding society on the local level. How has this been played in Egypt? We've seen a number of issues. First is this reemergence, or the start of this issue of forced evacuations. We had one incident before during the Mubarak era where a Christian family was forced to leave the area after an attack by a Muslim mob. However, this has dramatically increased. A recent documentary of such cases has documented that there are today 112 Christian families that have been forced out of their homes. This happened both in a village near Alexandria after a clash, after a rumor of a supposed relationship between a Christian man and a Muslim woman, leading to attacks on Coptic homes, indiscriminatory of the family of the accused. No, it's all the Copts or all the Christians in the area that are attacked. And as a result, a reconciliation session is usually held, deciding that the local Copts are supposed to leave. It repeated itself in Dahshur, a village near Giza, where again, a rumor, or not a rumor, but a tailor burning one of the shirts while ironing it, led to a clash between Christians and Muslims, and again, the families being forced to leave their area. It has also taken place in Rafah on the border with Gaza, where Christian families were told by Islamic militants that they are not welcomed in the area anymore, and the police practically told them, we're incapable of protecting you anymore. This has also meant an increase in rumors, stories about kidnapping of Christian girls. Now, of course, stories about kidnapping of Christian girls are always very problematic, given that a number of those cases, or a lot of those cases, often involve a love affair between a Christian girl and a Muslim man, and they go on their own. But when the cases involve children at the age of 14, 11 years old, 15-year-olds, then we're really talking about kidnapping and not something else. Particularly, for example, or significant is the case of Sara Ishaq, a girl from Matruh, 30th of September 2012. She's walking to school, she disappears. The police inform her worried parents, we know where she is, the local Salafis have her. But we basically can't do anything about it. Your only solution is to go to one of the leading Salafis of Alexandria, Yasser al-Burhami. He only can return your daughter to you. The family even meets President Morsi. Again, till today, Sara Ishaq has not returned to her family. We've seen also an increase in the number of attacks on Christian churches, meaning that we've had a recent documentation of such cases has documented 25 attacks on churches, 4 of them completely destroyed. Often it is, those attacks are started due to rumors either of 3 natures. Either there's a rumor that Christians are attempting to turn a building that they had always prayed in into an official church, or it is a rumor about a sexual relationship between a Christian man and a Muslim woman, or it is a rumor of a Christian insulting Islam. Usually this leads to attacks, burning of the church, attacks on Christian homes, looting them, and so on. We've had a number of those incidents. Increasingly also we've had an attempt by local Islamists to enforce their own views by meaning we allow, for example, Christians in the village to pray, but they are not allowed to welcome any Christians from outside the village to pray in it. This has been the case in a place as Bet Marco in Bani Suwaif, for example, in October 2012. Again, forced reconciliations. A village of Al-Basra near Alexandria. All of these incidents where there's an attempt to enforce their own views on society as a whole. This has also meant a very significant case, the attack on the church or the church building in Aswan in the south of Egypt. That later on led to the Maspero demonstration and the Maspero massacre. It's very interesting to look at what local Salafis were rejecting at that point. It is not the concept of Christians praying. That you can do. Yeah, you want to pray in your own home, you're free to do so. What they objected to in relation to the building was the following. It should not have any bell. It should not have a dome. It should not have a cross. It should not have a microphone, meaning it should not be a church. You're allowed to pray silently if you want to, but to publicly project your Christianity is the problem. So I'm not suggesting at all that what the Copts are facing in Egypt is something that the Islamists there are looking for annihilation of the Copts or anything of that nature. No, what we're seeing is that it is the attempt to force Copts to abide by certain standards. The last comment about such local cases involves the blasphemy cases. We have now 8 Christians in prison because of accusations that they insulted Islam. Now, the fact that the state has enforced such rules is problematic, but also problematic has been the idea that those cases also involve the local mob attacking the Christians and attempting to enforce their own rules on them. We've had the case, for example, of Makarim Diab, where he was not allowed even to have a lawyer. simply because the local Islamist mob has gathered around the courthouse and declared that any lawyer that would represent him would be killed. So the guy could not even have a legal representation. The attack of different trials of those Copts are also very significant here. So to conclude, how are the Copts reacting to all of this? Well, their situation is, to say the least, not very optimistic. They are not large enough in terms of a percentage to be able to affect the direction of the whole country. While they're significant in number, their overall percentage does not allow them to be the decision makers or to tilt the balance towards any political force. Unlike the Jews who were forced out of Egypt in the 40s and 50s, they don't have an Israel to go to. They are not geographically concentrated in one area. People, yes, assume that the Copts are concentrated in the south. Not anymore in reality. That changed dramatically in the 90s. So there's no possibility of even considering safe havens, anything of the like that would offer local protection. The only option in reality left to them is to pack their bags and leave. And that's a very sad state to discuss of a community that has existed as long as the country itself has existed. So we've seen a huge wave of immigration from Egypt. Numbers are thrown around about that, but based on my documentation work, it's huge, it's unprecedented, it's unlike anything we've seen before in Coptic immigration. It's gone both to traditional places of immigration in the West, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and also to other places, new places, Georgia, for example, in Eastern Europe. So that's the pessimistic note.
Thank you for bringing us back to reality. Thank you. I want to thank the panel. You've done a terrific job, and I'm very interested in your remarks. I know that Heba has to leave a little bit early, so let me, as moderator, throw out the first question to you, and that question is, how are women able today to participate in the public sphere? I mean, there's lots of questions about rising sexual harassment and so on. I mean, actual physical, not to mention emotional intimidation. So how are women able to participate? What would you suggest for expanding their involvement in politics and social issues? And how can they best do that? And how can we here in the West help?
Yeah, there is of course, we've all seen the horrific pictures coming from Tahrir Square in the past few months about group sexual harassment, mob sexual harassment, basically. And there are lots of theories about how that is happening. Is it just a result of the increased poverty and marginalization and the emergence of the marginalized group to the center of civic life in Egypt? Or is it actually orchestrated by one or the other of the active forces in the society? The debate goes on. I mean, again, like with so many things in transition, there is no conclusive answer to the source of this phenomena. Again, I like, because it is very easy when such upheavals happen and there is big disruption of the social order to assume that everything we're looking at is new. I sort of discipline myself to always ask the question, am I looking at a new phenomena or is there continuity in this context? Because unless you know how much change there is, you cannot really reach a solid analysis on how to tackle or what's the situation. So there is an element of continuity. Of course, there is novelty in scale and in the connection between this activity and the political protest movement, but there is also continuity because sexual harassment in Egypt and basically that a woman in Egypt could not walk freely, unhassled and unharassed, was a problem as far ago as in the 90s when I was still a student in Cairo, and even prior to the 2011 revolution, there were issues of during religious festivities, massive sexual harassment happens on the street as people are celebrating. I mean, so the phenomena of women being harassed on the street is not new. What is new is that it's happening in mob, and it is connected to women being on protest and practicing their political rights on the street. and by not just by security forces, because also prior to the 2011, like for example in the Kifaya protests in 2005, and in the subsequent protests by Kifaya and other movements on 6th of April and so on, there was utilization of sexual assaults by the police and thugs of the police to intimidate women off the street. So I just want to highlight this. Your question is, how are they coping? They are coping. Actually, part of the change, in the past when women were harassed, they used to shy away. There was the culture of shame, and the victim was ashamed of the crime. So what has changed, and it is very positive, and I consider it one of the trends that promise bode well for the women movement in Egypt, is that at least a percentage of women are no longer ashamed to come out and talk about what happened to them. And that, I think, is a very important moment, a very important element of empowerment. Without being able to get over the shame and come out and speak, the issue will never be tackled, and the state will never act upon it, and the society will never mobilize. So basically Egyptian women are coping by the sheer strength of their will. Egyptian women are very strong. I mean, historically they are very strong, and they are coping by simply saying, we will expose you, we will come out, and then these informal movements of anti-harassment movement led by both men and women are taking shape and organizing much more than in the past. Some, of course, activists are shrinking away from participating, female activists, but it is not they're diversifying their tools of participation. I mean, I'm not saying that they're abandoning or losing hope, but they are diversifying their tools of participation. How can people, the international community help? You will notice from my presentation that I talk about indigenization as very important to the consolidation of the women movement in Egypt. And I really, truly believe that unless the movement becomes local and accepted as local and perceived as local, it will never take root. So any assistance coming from the international community should be cognizant of this fact and should make sure that in the good effort of trying to help something good to emerge, we don't inadvertently undermine it. And that would be my closing tip before I have to rush out.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes more for questions. We are going to go about 5 minutes long because we are running a little bit long. What I would ask is that each speaker stand up, identify yourself, your affiliation, and ask a quick and to-the-point question, and we'll proceed from there. And I think we have microphones around the room. Okay, great. Right? Right over there, sir.
John Anderson, independent analyst. Question regarding political party and political campaign finance, often regulated in other countries by electoral commissions, electoral tribunals. Prosecution may rest in the hands of state public prosecutors, et cetera. In Egypt, I know the previous panel was reticent to talk about what might be foreign financing of political parties in Egypt. I know the Arab press and blogosphere is not so reticent to, and sees, of course, FGP financing from Qatar, either the state or individuals, and of course, press is full of comments about the financing from Saudi of Salafi groups, etc. Question is, what exists realistically in Egypt in the way of apparatus to investigate, oversee political party finance, and realistically, is there anything that can be done in the context of a politically appointed public prosecutor of carrying out anything that would effectively enforce Egyptian law?
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. Who's the expert on Egyptian political finance? Because I am not. I'll throw out my 2 cents. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of unregulated campaign finance that we've seen flowing into Egypt, mainly from the Gulf countries and so on. It becomes a problem when it comes from Western sources or others. And I don't know of a regulator except for state security, but I will let our Egyptian panelists address that further.
I'm just going to say a couple of things. Just to keep in mind that you're operating in an extremely sort of transient political environment where the state apparatus, or the various institutions don't necessarily speak well to each other, let alone themselves. So with that being said, I mean, the election law has not, at least the current election law, or the one being drafted, hasn't seen its way through just yet, and is a deeply problematic law from the standpoint of some of the opposition. And of course, it renders it somewhat unenforceable, but there's also very little safeguarding of political institutions from foreign financing for political campaigns. And of course, we understand fully that between the fall of the Mubarak government through until now, there have been at least between 9 and 12 election rounds, voting rounds. And in each of those circumstances, there's been no sort of systematic, bureaucratized, institutional assessment of where the funds are coming from to support these campaigns. In fact, even when it comes to presidential campaigns, we all know that the Muslim Brotherhood is either well-funded through sort of international means, or has, through its sort of neoliberal sort of economic policies, and over a span of at least 30, 40 years, have built a very sort of strong and substantial bedrock of economic sustainability. In some cases, very, very much entrenched in the Egyptian economy. So the Muslim Brotherhood are sort of safe to a large extent. But even take some of the secular liberal opposition. Someone like Hamdin Sabahi in the elections. There's no clarity as to where his money came from and how much money was actually spent. So they're really nobody's really filing the paperwork, and all the institutions are turning a blind eye for reasons that are it is the elephant in the room, but you cannot count on the public prosecutor to do that job in his current capacity, given who the public prosecutor is now. And I don't think one should be optimistic that if the current public prosecutor were to leave office and be replaced by his predecessor, that you would get anything better than what we currently have. So it is a nebulous, vague, unpredictable scenario from now all the way through, and I imagine there will continue to be regional and international players who continue to look at Egypt as very substantial, as you heard from the last panel, very substantial, very geostrategically important country that needs to be quote-unquote stabilized. And so the flow of money will continue to come in, but without the kind of scrutiny that you see with the NGOs, for instance, that are considered really problematic and and what have you. So there is a little bit of a double standard there.
Okay, thanks. Right over here.
My name is Ibrahim Hussein. I'm an Egyptian American living here in Washington, D.C. If I may ask the panel an unfair question. In this panel and the previous one, there are a lot of you listed all kind of problems and issues and concerns and difficulties and challenges facing Egypt, except for Maha, who mentioned, who was optimistic about her piece of it. Heba, yeah.
Heba.
Can you imagine any scenario or if development or action needed to turn it around? I'm sick and tired from the media and everybody else talking how bad things are, economy, transportation, education. Any idea for a scenario or a solution to the way out, or is it that Tom Friedman said, even God cannot help Egypt? I don't agree with that, but I'd like to get some feedback, line of direction.
Thanks. Great.
Well, concerning the situation of the Copts, I think the short answer is no, meaning that you can change laws and you can start a political process and inclusion. But what's very worrisome is the participation of your neighbors in attacks against you. Those people that attack Copts are not alien to them. They're very neighbors, people they went to school with, people that live nearby. It's this level of local hatred is very hard to overcome, even if you attempt a political process that would mean more inclusion for Copts, dealing with, ending this culture of impunity on attacks on them and so on. So while a political process might be helpful and would definitely change a number of steps, changing the constitutional articles, those things, what worries me the most is perhaps this local problems and the local hatreds that will take much longer to change.
Thanks very much.
Can I say something really
Yeah,
quickly?
please.
Okay, I'm going to overstep my own sort of territory and cross over into what Sam is talking about. I actually do see a little bit of a silver lining, and actually I think I've ended on that note when it comes to the media component, that the fact that the state has effectively taken a step back or has slowly sort of crumbled and can no longer deliver on its responsibilities kind of renders society the only true sort of provisional space whereby change can happen. So I think there is sort of something going on. In the same way that Heba described with the case of women, I also see that Copts have also come out of both anonymity and there is sort of a strong sort of Egyptian Coptic nationalist movement that has really sort of embraced the revolution as part of its own sort of discourse of tolerance. And even though I think Christians and Copts in Egypt have begun to participate in larger numbers. I mean, for those who cannot flock and cannot leave, which of course, no country, no space, no boundary, no border. Georgia cannot absorb, 7 million Copts. So many of them are there to stay. And by being there to stay, they have a choice of one of two things. Either to continue being what they were under the Mubarak era, which is increased visibility and anonymity and discreetness, and to basically sort of assimilate into this melting pot of Egyptianness that subdues their Christianness, or for them to come onto the scene and say, yes, I'm Christian, I'm proud, this is who I am, and I will not relent, I will not accept to be a second-class citizen in this country. I don't accept these constitutional provisions. I don't accept the burning of the churches, and there's a significant amount of retaliation. We saw that at an early point, even before the revolution, with the Umraniya attacks, which are really some of the first. This was, I think, November of 2010, the first major clashes between the state apparatus, the state police, and Christian protesters over the building of a church in Umraniya. And I think that has sort of continued. There is a growing feeling that we will not accept this anymore. Now, of course, that is, a pushback against a cascade. But nevertheless, I think there is, a glimmer of hope, because there is significant amounts of solidarity. I mean, yes, there are neighbors killing Christians, but there are also, a tremendous amount of sympathy and outpouring on the part of a large segment of the Egyptian Muslim population for Christians who refuse to accept that either the Salafis will monopolize, or radical Salafis will monopolize the discourse, or that the resolution to Egypt's sectarian problems is to drive the Christians out, or that they need to be migrated out. So I think there is sort of another side going on here.
Thanks. Yes, and then yes, go ahead. Okay. And then we have time for one more question, which is over here.
Just really quickly, because we were asked to comment on specific areas, and I don't want to take away from the fact that there is a serious crackdown on civil society. So I feel strongly about pointing that out. But at the same time, I'm actually, over the longer term, I am optimistic, because I see an amazing level of creative energy that's coming out of Egypt. People like Bessem Youssef, people like, or initiatives that we see from the youth. I mean, nobody can forget the sight of young people cleaning up the streets of Tahrir Square after the revolution. There is a tremendous amount of energy. The cat is out of the bag now. We can't talk about silent majority. That doesn't exist anymore. People are engaged at a very different level. But it's really important to create the space and the channels for them to do that effectively.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, one of the speakers, and I forget exactly who said it, I'm sorry, but said essentially that society is becoming bigger than the government right now. They're using all kinds of new tools of social media, organization, and so on, and the state's capacity to destroy that is becoming increasingly narrower, which is, I think, ultimately the best guarantee of an optimistic outcome in Egypt. I hope so, too. Andrea, go ahead.
Andrea Rue, Middle East Institute. My question is kind of a follow-up on the previous one. I'd like to ask about who's supporting, there's a lot of Coptic media too, a lot of Christian media, radio, television, all those kind of things. And from what I've heard, they're very inflammatory, which, I'd like to know who's supporting that and what role that plays in this Christian-Muslim thing.
The Coptic media, I mean, there has always been Coptic newspapers in Egypt for a long time, both historically and under Mubarak with the Watani newspaper. In the last couple of years under Mubarak, a number of TV channels, Coptic TV channels, were started by the Coptic Church or backed by specific bishops in the Coptic Church, whether it's CTV or Marimoros channel. They're now, I think, 2 or 3 of them operating. There are also a number of Christian broadcasts from outside of Egypt that target the Copts, mainly Protestant-driven from the United States, or by Coptic immigrants living in the United States. So you have a number of these, 5, 6 of them, that people can access while in Egypt through satellite channels and so on. As to inflammatory, I'm not aware that local Coptic media is inflammatory at all. Certainly the ones broadcasting from the West operate with different, under different rules than Egyptian society. One of them, Al-Hayah, had for a long time this controversial ex-priest from the Coptic Church, Zakaria Boutros, who's made it a habit of attacking Islam. But all of these channels operate from outside of Egypt. One of them was associated with the production of the infamous Innocence of Muslims movie and so on. So local newspapers, I don't believe there have been an increase in them. There is a number of smaller publications distributed inside the churches, mainly official ones, Al-Karaza, Al-Katiba Tibiyya, and others. But again, the inflammatory is mainly a question of those operating from outside the country, not inside.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions, but I really do appreciate the insightful comments of all of our panel members, and please join me in thanking them for their views and their time.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks to our fine panelists. Thanks to our audience for persevering through lunchtime. We'll be doing a lot more Egypt panels in the future, and look out for the new Arab Transitions website launching in about a week's time. Thank you all.